This material argues that the 95% failure rate of enterprise AI is caused by architectural flaws and semantic decay, not model limitations, and proposes a canonical data foundation as the solution. And honestly, the authoritative tone and the framing of concepts like semantic decay and the chain of action are just absolutely brilliant. But transitioning from diagnosing this architectural failure to actually implementing a canonical data layer requires bridging a significant practical gap.
Yeah, jumping straight into that gap, we really have to examine what this text is assuming about its audience,
Right.
Because the author does this phenomenal job tearing down the overlay model, which is, what most enterprises call their data lakes. And they paint this beautiful picture of a pristine canonical foundation.
Mm.
But transitioning from diagnosing architectural failure to implementing a canonical data layer requires bridging a significant practical gap. The text notes that the 5% of successful organizations invested in this foundation before they invested in AI.
Which is a profound observation, but
Right, but the target audience reading this, the 95% who are currently failing, they don't have a clean slate.
exactly.
They've likely already spent, tens of millions of dollars on data warehouses, lake houses, and just a whole graveyard of broken pilot programs over the last 5 years.
Yeah. Reading through this section, it feels kind of like telling an architect that the secret to a stable building is a solid, deep, concrete foundation.
Sure.
And objectively, that is completely true. But you're delivering this advice to someone who is currently standing on the 15th floor of a skyscraper that is visibly swaying in the wind.
That is such a vivid way to put it.
I mean, you can't just pause the wind, jack the entire building up into the air, and pour new concrete underneath it. You have to work with the structure that is already failing.
And that swaying skyscraper is the exact operational reality for a chief data officer today.
Oh, 100%.
If this text simply tells them that they need to rip and replace their entire global data architecture before they can deploy even one successful AI agent,
They're just going to close the document.
they will absolutely close the document. The sunk cost fallacy alone is going to prevent them from acting on this advice. So to make this actionable, the author really needs to build a conceptual bridge between the reader's current broken state and this ideal canonical state.
Right. We can't just leave them stranded on the 15th floor. I can see what you're going for here, so let's see how we can strengthen this. How does a company actually retrofit this foundational layer? I mean, do they have to boil the ocean, or can this be done incrementally?
That is the exact question the reader is asking. So the suggestion here is to introduce a short, highly tactical section that specifically addresses the migration reality.
Okay, I like that.
You have to speak directly to that CDO who literally just signed a massive renewal contract for their analytics platform. The text needs to explain if the canonical layer can be built incrementally.
Like isolating a specific domain?
Exactly. Give them a concrete example. Show how an enterprise can establish a canonical data model for a really specific, tightly contained domain like VAT position management or maybe intercompany reconciliation.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense.
Right? Because it illustrates that you can prove the AI's efficacy without having to re-architect the entire legacy ERP environment all at once.
It completely diffuses that panic of a massive system overhaul. But what about the initiatives they already have in flight? Because most of these readers, they probably have an AI pilot running on top of their data lake right now. Should they just, pull the plug on those?
See, that is an area where the material could offer incredibly sharp, counterintuitive advice.
Oh.
Instead of telling them to pause the pilot, clarify what they should do today. Tell them to let the pilot run, fully anticipate its failure in production, and then weaponize that specific, measurable failure.
Oh, wow. That is genius. I love it.
Use the broken pilot as the definitive, undeniable business case to fund the canonical layer for that one specific domain.
That kind of Machiavellian tactical advice, that really transforms this piece from just a theoretical diagnosis into a survival guide.
Exactly.
It changes the tone completely. It becomes deeply empathetic because you're acknowledging the sheer political reality of enterprise architecture.
Mm-hmm.
And so once they actually survive that migration path and start building this foundation, we really need to look at what they actually get out of it.
The payoff.
Yes, because the contrast between chain of thought and chain of action is a powerful framing device that currently gets buried under technical governance terms.
Yeah, the pacing in this section is a real missed opportunity, honestly. The material introduces this absolutely thrilling conceptual distinction. AI that just thinks and recommends, which is the chain of thought, versus an autonomous AI that actually executes, the chain of action.
It's a huge leap.
But the moment the text introduces that thrill of an AI taking autonomous action, it just hits the brakes. It pivots so heavily into the dense mechanics of governance.
Right.
Suddenly, we are totally bogged down in cryptographic audit trails and action parameters and escalation paths.
Well, as I understand it from the notes, the argument here is that governance is the key to chain of action. But is there a risk that focusing solely on the cryptographic audit trails early on might cause the business reader to tune out before they fully grasp the sheer operational power of an AI doing the work for them?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, you are entirely correct about the CFO's mindset. Their first question is going to be about risk mitigation.
How do I know this AI isn't going to accidentally wire $5 million to a random vendor?
Exactly. But from a narrative perspective, you have to elevate the operational before and after scenario to anchor the business value before detailing the heavy governance infrastructure required to manage it.
Right, make them want it first.
Exactly. The conceptual weight of an AI actually bypassing the human throughput ceiling, it just loses all its momentum when we immediately start reading about audit logs.
Yeah, so we need to paint the pain of the current state a bit more vividly to make the payoff hit harder.
Mm-hmm.
Let's expand on the specific example provided in the text regarding the reconciliation agent. Right now, it's a bit brief. How do we expand that to really twist the knife on that chain of thought bottleneck?
Okay, so imagine a mid-level finance professional sitting down at their desk at, say, 8 in the morning. They open their shiny new, very expensive AI dashboard, and the AI has brilliantly flagged 500 intercompany mismatches.
Okay, so the AI did exactly what it was sold to do. It thought about the data, analyzed the patterns, found the errors.
Yep, but it's stuck in the chain of thought. The human still has to manually click into each individual flag.
Ugh.
They have to open the ERP, validate the mismatch against their own internal logic, and then manually type in the correcting entries.
That sounds miserable.
If it takes even 3 minutes per mismatch, you are looking at 25 hours of highly paid human labor just to clear the queue for that single morning.
Wow.
And the worst part? Tomorrow, the AI is going to proudly present them with another 500 mismatches.
So the queue never actually shrinks.
Never. The brilliance of the language model is completely bottlenecked by human keystrokes.
That physically hurts to think about. You've essentially just given the employee an incredibly efficient boss that hands them an insurmountable pile of manual work every single morning.
Right. So contrast that immediately with the chain of action reality. The text needs to follow up that painful scenario with an agent that identifies the mismatch, validates it against the canonical rules, and applies the correcting entry instantly on its own.
So the 25 hours of labor drops to zero.
Drops to zero. The queue just ceases to exist. We aren't just speeding up a process here, we are structurally eliminating a bottleneck.
And once the reader feels the relief of that second scenario, standing in the penthouse of our metaphorical skyscraper looking at the view, then you introduce the governance.
Precisely, because now the governance, like the audit trail, isn't just some dry compliance necessity.
No.
It becomes the exact feature that gives the CFO the confidence to flip that switch from recommend to act.
Right. Without the audit trail, you are stuck doing 25 hours of manual clicks. With it, you literally get your life back.
Exactly.
That restructuring completely changes the momentum of the argument. It pulls the reader in with the operational payoff, and then uses that intense desire to justify the rigorous architectural requirements.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, none of that action is possible or safe if the underlying data isn't perfectly trustworthy. Which really leads us to the core mechanism of the foundation. Semantic decay is the strongest original concept in the material, yet it relies on an assumption that all data lakes inherently destroy business meaning.
And this is perhaps the most critical vulnerability in the entire text.
Yeah?
Yeah. The material categorically states that moving data from an ERP to a data lake strips it of its contextual integrity, basically reducing complex business reality to just mere numbers and metadata.
Which sounds great on paper.
It declares definitively that metadata is not meaning, And for a general business audience, that is a highly persuasive, very sticky phrase.
Right.
But this material is also targeting deeply technical readers.
Yeah, so that makes sense, but could the evidence also support a different conclusion? For instance, what if a reader argues that their modern analytical platform is highly sophisticated and captures all that currency and hierarchy logic? We need to make sure the connection between extraction and inevitable decay is fully bulletproofed against that exact defense.
We really do. Because if I'm a senior data engineer or like a system architect who has spent the last decade of my career meticulously building a modern data warehouse,
You're going to be pretty defensive.
I'm reading that line and I'm throwing my hands up. I'd argue, wait a minute, we absolutely capture relationships. We use complex DBT models, we have dimensional mapping, we capture temporal logic in our snowflake environment.
Right?
And by not acknowledging this common counter-argument, the author leaves their most compelling concept completely vulnerable to dismissal by technical readers.
The risk is that the data engineer dismisses the entire white paper because they feel insulted or just misunderstood.
Exactly. So to fix this, the suggestion is to preempt the technical counter-argument by nuancing the critique of data lakes.
Okay, how do we do that?
The author needs to explain exactly why the effort to capture meaning in an analytical layer ultimately fails at production scale. It isn't that data engineers are lazy or that the tools don't try to capture meaning.
Right.
It's that the architecture is structurally doomed by latency.
Okay, so how do we break down that mechanical reality for the reader? How do we show that extracting data inevitably leads to semantic decay despite the absolute best efforts of the engineering team?
You need to explicitly address the data engineer's defense in the text. Acknowledge that while organizations try incredibly hard to map ERP business logic into their data lakes using metadata, this extraction and transformation logic just cannot keep up with how the source systems continuously evolve.
Because the core ERP is, what, a living, breathing operational system. The business rules are constantly shifting.
Provide a concrete example of this. Imagine the business makes a fast operational change on a Tuesday.
Okay.
Say they update the temporal rules, or maybe the complex currency conversion logic in the ERP to reflect a new market reality.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the data lake's extraction mapping, the SQL code that is pulling and transforming that data, it probably isn't scheduled to be updated to reflect that new logic until the engineering sprint cycle finishes on Friday.
Oh, I see. So for 3 entire days, the data lake is fundamentally out of sync with the financial reality of the business.
Exactly. The numbers are flowing in, but the meaning attached to them is totally outdated. The lake has suffered semantic decay.
Wow.
And in those 3 days, an autonomous AI model reading from that data lake might make a confident, split-second, million-dollar action based on that outdated currency logic.
That is terrifying.
Right? The decay isn't a philosophical argument about what metadata is. It is a harsh mechanical reality of latency and synchronization.
That makes the concept of semantic decay just completely undeniable. You've taken it out of the realm of theory and placed it into the everyday nightmare of pipeline maintenance.
And you use that exact latency example to reinforce why the canonical layer is structurally superior. It's not because data lakes don't try to capture meaning, but because capturing it continuously at transaction speed in an extracted layer is practically impossible.
Right.
If you bulletproof the argument this way, you turn the skeptical data engineer from an adversary into an ally.
Because you're diagnosing the root cause of the pipeline breaks they deal with every single month. You're showing them that the swaying of the skyscraper isn't their fault. It's the fault of the foundation they were forced to build on.
Exactly.
This has been a deeply insightful breakdown. Looking at the broader thematic journey of our critique today, this submitted material is incredibly strong and authoritative. But it reaches an elite level by doing 3 key things. First, addressing the practical friction of retrofitting a canonical layer. Second, highlighting the operational thrill of chain of action before bogging down on governance. And third, bulletproofing the brilliant semantic decay argument against technical counterattacks.
Yeah, so to summarize the concrete steps the writer can take, add a short migration reality section that addresses the sunk cost fallacy of the data lake.
Mm-hmm.
Then, expand the reconciliation before and after scenario to vividly contrast the manual bottleneck against instant execution. And finally, directly address the metadata counterargument by explaining how operational latency inevitably causes semantic decay.
We absolutely love seeing material of this caliber, and we warmly invite the listener to implement these revisions and submit their updated work back to the show for another round of feedback. We really want to see how this evolves because the blueprint here is incredibly solid. We just need to make sure we aren't asking the reader to pour concrete while they're still swaying in the wind on the 15th floor.